So let me introduce myself. In 1983, I started a new assistant professor. I started a journal, Domestic Animal Endocrinology, and I was editor for 25 years. And then I became editor of Animal Frontiers, Journal of Animal Science, and I started a new journal, Translational Animal Science. If you'll notice the dates, I was editor of all three at the same time. It was really hard. And then they asked me to come back and be editor of Animal Frontiers again. And then I became CEO of the American Society of Animal Science the 1st of August. So what I want to do is talk to you about writing a paper. We'll start with the parts of a paper. Then we're going to submit that paper, and I'm going to show you how I manage it as editor. And then we're through that, we'll talk about the review process and how to respond to reviewers and what are the common things that a reviewer might say about a paper. So the first question is, should you even write a paper? And I've kind of put some things together here, and I'm not going to spend any time but just read them. Do you have a novel and innovative hypothesis? Does your data provide new information to the scientific literature? Is your paper descriptive or is it mechanistic? And if you don't know the difference, I'll cover some of these things later on. Is your experimental design adequate to answer the question that you propose? Are your statistics appropriate for the experimental design? And at some point, are your conclusions consistent with your starting hypothesis, your data? Does it all make a story? Okay, so you've decided you can write a paper. So the next thing to do is choose a journal. There are a lot of things that go into it, and so for me, I'm going to choose probably a society journal because I know I've got good reviewers, a good reputation. There are a lot of members who are going to read my paper, and those are important to me. I might also look at what are the journals that I read. And when I'm writing my paper, what journals am I citing? I probably want to be publishing in one of those, right? Some people use scientific impact factor. So we look at scientific impact factor as if it means journal quality. It really doesn't. So what can I tell you about journal impact factor? I can tell you, and this is from 2003, and the reason I use it is my journal was the #1 journal. So it doesn't matter, but I really like it, right? So that year, the highest ranked journal had a 2.7 impact factor and the lowest a 0.01. So what can I tell you? I can tell you that if you're looking at the top 30 or 40% of that list, they're pretty good journals. People are reading them, people are citing papers from them. If I'm looking at the bottom part of that list, probably not many people are reading them, they're not being cited. Can I tell you that the #1 journal is better than the #4 journal? Is it better than the #10 journal? I cannot tell you that. So you might have Domestic Animal Endocrinology, Genetics, Journal of Dairy Science, Journal of Animal Science. Those are totally different kinds of journals, and you can't compare them. So ASAS has signed on to DORA, D-O-R-A, to say that we will not emphasize impact factors, and most of the major journals are doing this now. The next thing is, I want to make sure you avoid predatory journals. So what is a predatory journal? So they might do something like take our title, Journal of Animal Science, and put an S on the end, so Journal of Animal Sciences, and their website will look exactly like ours. They have a really good editorial board. But if you call your friends who are on the editorial board, they don't know it. And so if you give them your money, they will publish your paper. But what happens if they go out of business? Your paper is lost for science forever. So that's why society journals are pretty good, because they make sure that those journals are always going to be there and your science will always be there. So the most important thing on this slide is to get the instructions to authors and follow them very closely. Because if you don't follow the instructions, I don't have to publish your paper. Okay, we're going to start through the parts of a paper. So the first thing is a title. Is the title important? So you've probably done a literature search, right? You put in keywords and you get a whole list of titles, and you're going down that list till you find something that interests you. So What I want to show you here is that you can choose a title to attract attention to your article for the readers you want to see it. So this was my working title on this paper, The Effect of AGRP on Feed Intake in Sheep. So I wanted to take my work to the Endocrine Society. And this is a society that's mostly rat and human. So if they see the word sheep on a title, they go, eh, and walk away, right? So I thought, how could I make these rat people and these physicians stop and look at my sheep paper? So I changed the title. So I changed the title, A Role for AGRP in Appetite Regulation in a Species with Continuous Nutrient Delivery, a sheep. So people stopped and said, that's so novel. You mean they're not like a rat who eats and then fasts and eats again? You mean they're getting energy all? I went, yeah, they're sheep. The point is you can write a title to attract attention from the audience you want to see your paper. Please pay attention to your title. It's very important. So the next thing on the list of a paper is the authors. And so you want to select which authors are going to be on your paper. But there's a lot of interest in being open about, what do these authors do? Should they really be on the paper? So I put some questions on here you might ask yourself, like, did they help you do the research? Were they out there collecting samples? Were they working in the lab next to you? Did they make a real contribution to your paper? Maybe they had something to do with the development of your hypothesis, or maybe some intellectual component that was critical to your paper. Like maybe your major professor, right? So my wife is a pathologist, and one of her groups was having trouble diagnosing a tumor. And she just looked at it and she said, why don't you try this? And it turned out they were able to diagnose the tumor because she had an idea that they hadn't thought of. Maybe she should be on that paper. So think about these things very carefully. Did they have maybe a special role? Maybe they did your statistical analysis for you. Does that deserve it, being on a paper? Maybe so. Or maybe you did your methodology. You did a method in somebody else's laboratory, and they provided you money and supplies and helped you make it work. Did they deserve to be on the paper? So an old mentor of mine, Dennis Marple, he was a department head at Auburn and Iowa State in animal science. He used to tell me it only takes 12 ATP of energy to write somebody's name on a paper, but if you leave them off and they're angry at you, it could take your whole career. So in other words, pay close attention to who you put on or leave off. So the next thing is the abstract. Is an abstract important? So you remember that literature search we did and got a list of titles? You choose a title you like, click it on, and where does it go? It goes to an abstract. So what your abstract should do is provide a little bit about your hypothesis or your objectives, a little about your methods, show some results with some p-values in it, and a solid conclusion, right? But if you look at an abstract and you can't decide why they did the work, you don't see any evidence of statistics, and maybe the conclusion says, we have to do more work, but that's all they say, you're not going to go get the paper, right? You're going to go back to the list of titles and find some other paper to read. Next is the introduction. The introduction is a logical series of paragraphs where you try to convince the reader of your paper or the reviewer of your paper that you have a solid scientific basis for your work. You're also going to give me some historical concepts about what led up to your hypothesis, but this is where you sell your idea to the reviewer. If you convince him this is a really cool thing, he's going to read your paper, right, and be good with it. So, next is the materials and methods. This is a detailed statement of what you did, but remember, as a reviewer or a reader, I was not there. You have to give me this mental image so that I understand everything that you did, and more importantly, I can repeat your work. If I can't repeat your work, it's not going to be good for us. There are estimates in biomedical science that 25% 98% of medical papers cannot be repeated. So it's very critical that you do a good job on your materials and methods. Next is the results section, and this is where you present your data in a very objective manner. So you have control over how you show your data. You can choose a table. So nutritionists like tables with all of their dietary constituents. But I'm a physiologist and kind of simple-minded. I like pretty pictures, so I'm going to go with a figure. But whether you choose a figure or a table, we say that these two things must stand alone in the paper. So what I mean by that is I should be able to see your figure and understand it without reading the whole paper. So when you do your figures or tables, make sure the titles, the figure legends, the information in there is clearly understandable. Okay, in your results section, you're going to tell me that there are non-statistically significant comparisons. But typically, we don't talk about that in the discussion. It only belongs here. So if your data is non-significant and someone else has published that their data was significant, then you talk about it. But if it's not significant, we typically don't talk about it outside of the results. So people also want to talk about trends in their data. So if you talk about a trend, make sure you define a trend. So a trend might be defined as significance level P less than 0.06 to P less than 0.1. Remember that if you chose P less than 0.05 as significant, this is non-significant. You can't build your whole discussion on non-significant data. In the results section, don't try to interpret your data. That's what you do in a discussion. Okay, the last part is the next part is the discussion. And this is the fun part, because this is where you get to tell the reader what your data means to you. In your discussion, you should tell us somewhere that you either accepted or rejected your hypothesis. You should talk about how your information relates to the scientific literature. I want you to integrate your information into our current thinking. So tell me also how your data is advanced scientific knowledge. So these are kind of all tied together, but avoid too much speculation. So you can really only talk to me about what your data has proved or disproved. You can't make up some big crazy idea. At the end, I want to see a concise summary or conclusion. When I walk away from your paper, what I want to know is, why is your paper important to science, and why should I remember your paper instead of the other 10 that I read? So the next is the references. And your references should only cite those articles that are relevant to your study. Do not use more references than you need. So if you're doing a research paper and you have 200 references, that's probably too many. In the instructions, some journals will tell you how many papers, like no more than 30 or 60. But if they don't give you a specific number, go through the journal and look for papers like yours and just get an idea of how many they're using in that journal. Make sure you check the journal style for references for your paper. As a reviewer, if I see that you're using a style for the papers that's different than the journal that you're submitting to, I'm going to think that your paper was rejected. You submitted it again but forgot to change your references. So this is not uncommon that we see papers where the references are in the wrong style. As a reviewer, I'm going to go back through because I think your paper got rejected and there must be a reason. So I'm going through looking at it harder than I would if you had followed instructions. Make sure your information that you cite is correct. So if I'm reviewing your paper and I want to find one of your references, but you've made a mistake and I can't find that reference, then I can't check your methods. And I wonder, if you make this mistake, what other mistakes did you make when you did your research? Make sure you use recent references. So I want you to tell me historically where your ideas have come from and what important research has been done. But I also remember, I want you to integrate your information into our most current thinking. And if you don't use current references, you're not doing that. I had a friend who sent a paper in and I ended up being the reviewer. This was in about 2015 and the references only went up to 2008. So what he had done is he had the paper rejected and threw it in the drawer. And he pulled it out and just mailed it off again 10 years later, right? Okay, you kind of know all of those things, so let's change gears and submit your paper now. So in the old days, we used to submit a cover letter. And there were certain things that went into the letter. You can kind of do it now, but there are a couple of important things to know about submitting. You should only submit to one journal at a time. If you submit your paper to 2 different journals, that's really bad. And if we catch you, you're rejected, and will both journals ban you from publishing. Make sure that all authors on your paper have read and approved the submission of your paper. Okay, if you don't do this, it's scientific misconduct. If an author calls me and says, I didn't know my name was on this paper, I'm going to reject your paper. And that author can bring you up on scientific misconduct charges at your university or research unit or whatever. Most journals will offer you an opportunity to submit reviewer names. If you're going to do that, please give me contact information. I'm not going to go find them for you. So, as an editor, I expect you are going to submit names to me of someone who can critically review your paper. But I know you're thinking, if I use my mother's, brother's, cousin's college roommate, they'll give me a good review. So if I don't know the reviewer you suggest, I'm going to check that reviewer out to make sure they're good. Journals will also allow you to say, give a list of names of people you shouldn't or you don't want to review your paper. If you're going to do that, tell me why there is a conflict of interest that person shouldn't review your paper. If you don't tell me, I may not pay attention. Okay, so I made this up, because I didn't want to be plagiarizing, right? But it has all the elements of an editor's to-do list. And so I come down here and I see, oh, I have a new assignment. I click it on. And it takes me to a reviewer summary screen, and I want to go through a couple of things that are on this screen. So I'm going to send your paper out maybe to 5 reviewers. The first 2 that come back, so I can put the number here, the first 2 that come back, this paper now moves to a new file for me to make a decision. The next place is the the Manuscript Central will automatically insert your title into this space, and it'll search the entire scientific literature and bring me a list of all the papers that are similar so I can look for reviewers. And then down here, it gives me multiple opportunities. So one thing is, what if I know the reviewer that would be perfect for your paper? I just type their name in, pulls it out of my database, sends the paper to the reviewer. If I know he's the perfect reviewer for a paper, I put his name in and it searches my list of people who are reviewers. I can add new reviewers to my database, and 97% of the time what we do is put in the keywords you give us and match it up to the keywords of the reviewers that we have. But what if I don't know the reviewer? I'm going to do some kind of search to find out if they're appropriate for your paper. I'm going to want to know, are they from your university? Have you published with them before? There are a couple of places we can go to do that. So what I'm going to show you, I've broken into several slides just because it's long continuous, right? So one place we go is, this is embedded in Manuscript Central, is Clarivate Analytics Web of Knowledge. So Clarivate's a company. So I just put my own name in there so you could see. And then the other place I'm going to use is the National Library of Medicine. So let's put my name in and see what comes up. So one thing you can do is tell right away whether anyone's ever cited this author or not. So an important issue, right, is this person really being recognized as a scientist? So I can tell that here. And so you might see I did this in 2009, so I just did, anyway. So the next slide I'm going to show you is an old one. So Thomson Reuters used to own this, and they just sold it to Clarivate. I kept this old one because I want to make a point. But what we see is a list of every paper this reviewer has ever written. I can click on one of these, and it shows me everybody that's ever published with this person, and it shows me the type of research they're doing and whether they're currently working in your area or not. So I can determine whether this person is related to you in some way, if they're a good reviewer, if they're a respected scientist in your field. So just remember, if you look at Clarivate today, it doesn't look like this anymore. It's sexier. And that's why we keep computer people around, right? So they can change it all the time. So the reason I kept this old one is if you look at these references in this different color, these are all references to the same paper. And so what I want to show you is this is the actual paper. It's American Journal of Physiology, volume 248, page E108 in 1985. But look, they messed up 6 out of roughly 10% of the citations got either the volume or the page number wrong. That's a very high error rate for such a tiny piece of a paper. So if I was looking for this, I would never find it, right? Make sure you check your references for accuracy. Make sure if you revise your paper and you take a reference out of the paper, that you also take it out of the references. If you add one, make sure you add it. So this is the way that PubMed would work. It's the same thing, but let's just say I want to find a reviewer on appetite. So I put in the reviewer's name, in this case it's mine, and I go, this doesn't have any, but oh, here's a paper on appetite regulation. Here's another one. So you can see who I'm publishing with. So if you and I are on the same paper, I'm not going to send this reviewer that paper. If you're at the same university, I probably am not going to send it to, right? Because you want somebody that's not related to the author. Okay. The reviews come back to me. And I get one reviewer saying published with revision, one says reject. So what am I going to do with this paper? I got to read both sets of reviews, right? In most cases, this paper is probably rejected. But if I read this person who's rejected, if I read that and I disagree with it, I don't have to pay attention, right? I can say this person's really wrong. But I could also read this person's and say, this person wasn't very critical, because when I read this paper, I see lots of problems with it. Sometimes I won't be able to decide. Maybe it's not exactly in my area. But remember, I sent it to 5 reviewers, right? And so what I can do is go get another review to come in, and then I'll agree with whichever is the majority opinion. And that happens a lot. This is an actual case of a paper I had because I want to make a point. When I read the reject person's review, he said, this is either the best paper I've ever seen or it's the worst paper I've ever seen. He said, I read the materials and methods, and if he did it this way, it's really good, but if he did it this way, it's bad, and I can't tell what he did. So when I read that, my decision was to let the author revise his paper and send it back. I emailed it to him. Within a few hours, the author wrote me back and said, I'm embarrassed because I read my materials and methods and I don't know what I did either. One of the big mistakes is you write out what you did, but you don't go back and check the materials and methods because you know what you did and it must be okay. Remember, as a reviewer or a reader, I don't know what you did. You have to demonstrate to me. You have to make me be able to see everything that you did, or I don't understand your paper, and if I don't understand your paper, I'm going to reject it. So I'm going to go off script a minute, but remember, when you're writing a paper or when you're writing a grant, You don't know who that other person is. They may not be specialists in your area. You have to give them enough information that they can understand what's going on. So he revised the paper, sent it back. This reviewer accepted the paper. It was published and highly cited. He came this close to having his paper rejected because he didn't proof his own paper. Now, what I want to do is give you some ideas about common complaints that reviewers come up with. So when I was editor of Domestic Animal Endocrinology, my wife was editor of Veterinary Pathology. So we would put the kids to bed, turn the TV down, and we'd sit on the couch with our laptops, and I'd go, hey, look what that guy wrote, man. And so we'd exchange what people were saying, and we thought, I ought to write these down. This is my list. So I'm just going to go through this. It's in no particular order. Some of them I won't talk about much. Some of them I'll spend more time on. This paper doesn't add anything new to the scientific literature. This is the kiss of death. This will get your paper rejected, right? So why do we do research? To add new information, and if you don't achieve that, we're probably not going to publish your paper. A lot of times you'll get something that says this paper is fine, but it's just descriptive, or they may say there's not enough substance to warrant publication. So what's a descriptive paper? So I have two groups of sheep. These are controls, and this group I'm giving some drug to or something in the diet, right? And they grow faster. They get bigger. And you're all excited, right? Look, they grew bigger. I'm going to publish this. Because really, yeah. And so you send it in, and the reviewer says, well, this is just descriptive. We don't want to publish this. So what I would want you to do, I'm a physiologist, right? I want to know, are these sheep eating more? Is their metabolic rate different? Is their endocrine system, so like growth hormone is up or insulin? So I want you to give me some idea of why that difference is taking place. If you give me some of that, I mean, you don't have to go all the way down to the electron transport level, but you have to give me enough information that I have an idea of why this is happening. You had a question?
Yes, sí.
En inglés o en castellano?
Como quieras, está bien.
I have a question for you, Doctor. Regarding the hypothesis, as a reviewer or an editor, what do you suggest to the authors? To describe the hypothesis? Or
Are you talking about this?
Yes, because in some journals you can see that the authors do not describe the hypothesis. And some others, you can see all the hypotheses described, and then they conclude that the results support or do not support the hypothesis. What do you suggest?
So they're interested in new science, new ideas. They're not interested in whether a sheep does the same thing as a rat or not. So if the sheep is different from a rat, they'll publish it. But if the sheep works like the rat, they'll say, well, we already know the biology, we don't care. So this one is that results don't prove or disprove the stated hypothesis. So if I don't know whether you answered the question or not, I'm kind of confused. Did not follow instructions to authors. Remember, if you don't follow instructions, I don't have to publish your paper. So most of the time I'll let you fix it later if you've got a good paper. But get the instructions to authors and follow them. Yeah. Okay. Did not follow animal welfare regulations, or the reviewer states that there are concerns about animal welfare. So in the U.S. we have an Institutional Animal Care Use Committee, which we call IACUC. And so when you submit a paper, you have to tell us that this committee at your university has approved your project. And some journals ask for the approval number, and if you don't have that, you cannot publish. But you can also say that you followed the regulations published in the Ag Guide. Or if you live in Switzerland, you might write, we followed the rules and regulations as prescribed by the Canton of Bern. And those are all okay, but you have to tell me that you followed some outside guide for animal welfare. If a reviewer comes back, so you've done all this, or you don't get reviewed. But if a reviewer comes back and says, I have concerns about inhumane treatment of animals, we will probably reject your paper. Okay, sometimes we get a paper that has no hypothesis, no objectives. I have no idea why they did it. I'm probably not going to review it. Figure legends don't provide sufficient information for me to understand it. I probably won't reject your paper, but I'm going to make you redo it, so why not do it right the first time? A common thing, strangely, is the experimental design is inadequate for the question, so you can't really answer the question by the way the study was designed. But it's just like an abstract. So another thing is insufficient animal numbers, so that I don't have confidence that they're in the statistics or the results. There's a problem with your design where you use pins of animals, and I'll explain that in a minute. Or if you're doing cell culture, you don't have enough replicates. That's what this is all about, is having enough replicates that I have confidence in the outcome. In the case of pins, let me give you just a simple description of what we're talking about with pins. So if I have 2 sets of 10 sheep, and I'm putting something in the diet in this group over here, and these are a control, how do I know that everybody in that pen got the same amount of the drug in the food, or got the same amount of nutrition? I don't, right? So animal cannot be the replicate in this experiment. Rather, I need 10 sets of pins, and pin becomes the replicate. So make sure you're doing your analysis, your statistics properly. Make sure you give me all the information you can to make your experiment repeatable, like sex, species, breed, strains, the antibodies, reagents, your design, everything. Make sure I can repeat your study. If you leave something out, your study is not repeatable. So if you publish a paper and you make a statement about science, and I try to repeat your study and I can't, I may get different results, and I'm going to publish my paper saying that you were wrong. You don't want that to happen. Make sure your information is such that I can repeat your work. So the next thing is methods are not adequate. So this is kind of vague. So what do I mean? So sometimes we get a paper where people use a really old method. It's not up to date. We have things that are better, cheaper, more specific, better quantitative. We want you to use the best method that you can find and get a hold of and use for yourself. The other thing about methodology is you must validate the techniques that you're using. If you don't prove to me that your technique works and gives me real, believable numbers, I can't accept your paper. Okay. Poor quality illustration. So I can't understand your figure. I might make you do it, or I might reject your paper if I just go, I don't get it. Disorganized progression of a paper. So we have a really cool outline for science, right? You've got an introduction, a materials and methods, a results, and a discussion. But within that, you have to be organized and write well. So, you know, you start reading through the introduction, it's like a 6-year-old kid who's saying, wow, there's a cloudy, oh, look at the squirrel, right? It's like a kid with ADHD and no medication on board. So remember, the progression in your paragraphs has to make logical sense. You're telling a story. You can't get distracted and go off all over the place, right? Tell me a logical story about your research. So this last one, about overstating the significance of your work. I had a paper once where this person wrote in the paper, I'm reviewing it, and this scientist wrote, this is the best paper ever done in my field. As scientists, your reviewers are capable of determining if your paper is the best ever. And we'll tell you that, but if you tell us, we may like, so your email gives you a little ding, and you look in there, and you've got the response on your paperback. And then you start reading, and they're criticizing your baby, right? And you start getting like kind of, you grab something and throw it, you're mad. How, you know? that's probably not a good time to respond. So I went to see my wife one day. We were in the same building. I went downstairs and I was about to knock on the door, and I hear screaming and yelling inside. So I kind of peeked around the corner, because and I looked inside, and my wife is sitting at her desk, and she's holding her telephone out like this, and I can hear an author screaming at her about how stupid she is, how idiotic her reviewers are, how dare they say these things. And I'm going, why would you do that? You don't want to make them angry, right? You want them to publish your paper. They're trying to help you. If you make them mad, they will not help you. So my wife put her phone down, went onto the computer, and clicked reject. So when I get a paper like that, I get mad too, and so I go eat lunch or something, right? Or go to the gym, something, and I come back and I read it, and I'm still like, wow. And then when I get to the point where I can go, well, maybe I should have had more animals. Maybe they got a point. I could have done this. That's when you sit down and respond. So you're going to respond. So what I might do is take the reviewer comment and put it in my word processing program. And underneath, I might have my responses, and I might say, I agree with the reviewer. I have made the changes requested. Here are the changes that I made, and here's where you can find it in the paper. Because you don't want me to have to read your whole paper to find 2 words you changed. Make sure that you follow the instructions so that I can find what you've changed. So Hugo and I had this question the other day, why do badges always get turned around? I know mine was this way when I started talking, and now it's this way. So let me go back. So maybe I don't understand what the reviewer wants me to say or do. But you can't not answer them, right? So I might say, it was unclear what the reviewer was asking me to do, but there's a problem here, right? So I've rewritten this paragraph in hopes that it now makes more sense. And here's what I've written, and here's where you can find it. So can you disagree with the reviewer? Yes, you can. So I might say, well, let me ask you this. How do you disagree with a reviewer? Besides you don't want to say you're an idiot, but look here, right? So what do you do? So if you're a student right now, what are you learning? You're learning the scientific method. You're learning how to think critically and logically. You're learning the literature in your field, and those are the tools that you employ to disagree. So I would say, here is my reason, and you give them a logical, scientific reason for disagreeing with the reviewer. And most of the time, the reviewer will say, okay, and the editor will be okay. Sometimes they make you do it a couple of more times. You don't know. But yes, you can disagree with the reviewer. Just don't be rude, right? I had a really famous scientist send me a paper, and I sent the reviews back. It was page after page after page of corrections. Really quickly, he sent it back and said, I've made all of the changes requested. He didn't do it line by line, point by point. He said, I made them all. I started reading. I couldn't find any changes whatsoever. What do you think I did? I rejected his paper, right? Make sure you respond to all of the reviewer comments. Almost everyone, I think maybe everyone who's ever submitted a paper has had a rejection. So there are a lot of reasons for a rejection. Probably there's some critical flaw in the paper. It could be that you chose the wrong journal. So if you're doing a nutrition paper and you send it to a quantum chemistry journal, right? They don't have the right reviewers. You're going to get rejected. But let's take an example. Endocrinology says they only take the top 25% of papers in their field. So if you're in the top 30% of papers in the field, you got rejected. But does that mean you have a bad paper? Not necessarily. So what do? Most times you take the reviewer comments, after you get through being angry and calling that journal editor all sorts of names, you take the reviewer comments, rewrite your paper, and send it to another journal. Typically one that's a little maybe further down, but mostly you can get them accepted, right? And you can get accepted in a pretty good journal. Just because you're rejected doesn't mean that the paper is a bad paper, but that maybe you went to the wrong journal and you should try a different one. Plus, all of those comments they make are going to improve your paper if you change your paper. Sometimes, I have a friend, Rod Johnson, who's now, I think, department head at Illinois, isn't he? He had a paper rejected by the Journal of Animal Science, and he redid it because it was really, they had a lot of comments. Instead of sending it to a lower tier journal, he sent it to endocrinology and they accepted it with no revision, right? So sometimes you can go for a really high journal. But I take it because the Journal of Animal Science reviewers gave him such good information that it improved the quality. But in general, you can rewrite the paper and it mostly gets accepted somewhere. Sometimes you get your paper rejected and you feel you were treated unfairly. You can appeal that rejection. But if you're going to appeal it to me, make sure you give me a really good reason that your paper was somehow treated wrongly or misunderstood or whatever. If you just write me and say, "Dear Dr. Sartin, I think my paper should be reviewed again," I'm going to say, no. If you give me a good reason, what I would typically do is send it out to one of the other reviewers and a new reviewer. In 3 years or 3.5 years, whatever I did with Journal of Animal Science, I had 4 people come back and say there was a problem with the reviews. I agreed in one case that he was treated unfairly. In the other case, I thought, no, your paper's bad, but I think if you redid your experiments and stuff and improved it, I would let you send it back to us. In most cases, it doesn't work. I'm not going to go against my reviewers unless there's something really obvious that was done improperly. Thank you for your attention.